When I married Caroline, I truly believed we had something rare, a connection built on trust, laughter, and dreams for the future. We had carved out a comfortable life together over the years, filled with shared goals and the kind of routine that feels stable rather than stifling. I never suspected that anything could tear us apart. That sense of security began to unravel in the most mundane way imaginable. It started with a small, almost inconsequential discovery in the bathroom. A strip of birth control pills, half-used and hastily tucked away in a drawer. At first, I dismissed it as an odd oversight. Caroline and I hadn't needed birth control in years. After my vasectomy 2 years ago, such measures were unnecessary. The realization hit me with a thud. Why would Caroline have birth control pills at all? I tried to brush it off as an error, an old prescription she'd forgotten to throw out, but a creeping sense of unease settled in my chest. Looking back now, I wonder if I always knew something was amiss, but I chose not to see it. The late nights at work, the muted notifications on her phone, the way she'd pull away when I tried to ask about her day. Each little thing added up to something I didn't want to acknowledge. Until now, I hadn't allowed myself to connect the dots. The discovery of that pill strip was a crack in the foundation of my marriage. I didn't realize it at the time, but it was the first step on a journey that would unravel everything I thought I knew about Caroline, my family, and even myself. After finding the birth control pills, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the pills themselves. It was the way Caroline's recent behavior started to make sense in a way I didn't want it to. She'd become more guarded, her phone always clutched tightly in her hand or left face down on the table. She laughed less, seemed distracted during our conversations, and had started working longer hours on projects she wouldn't fully explain. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was stressed at work. Maybe the intimacy between us had dulled over the years, and this was her way of coping. Or maybe I was imagining things, turning a single odd discovery into a conspiracy. But the unease wouldn't leave me. It crept into my thoughts at work, at home, even in my sleep. One evening, I decided to bring it up. I found something strange in the bathroom. I said, my voice steady but betraying the tension I felt. Birth control pills. I thought we didn't need those anymore. Caroline barely missed a beat. Oh, those? They're old. Probably from before your vasectomy. I'll toss them. She laughed nervously, but the sound felt hollow. Her answer didn't sit right with me. I couldn't remember her using birth control, even back then. We'd relied on other methods before my surgery. Her explanation was plausible enough to make me question myself. But her delivery, it was too quick, too smooth. That night, I lay awake, replaying the conversation in my mind. I wanted to believe her. For the sake of our marriage, our children, and everything we'd built together, I wanted to dismiss my doubts as paranoia. But something deeper, a gut instinct I couldn't ignore, told me there was more to the story. The following week, I began to notice more signs. Caroline's phone buzzed constantly, and she seemed irritated when I asked who was texting. She'd leave the room to take certain calls, claiming it was just work. Her once relaxed demeanor had shifted to one of quiet tension, and her affection toward me felt rehearsed. I told myself I wouldn't pry. I didn't want to be that husband, the controlling, paranoid man who reads his wife's texts or accuses her without proof. But the doubts had taken root, and they were growing faster than I could contain them. One evening, when Caroline was in the shower, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up, and for a split second, I saw a name I didn't recognize, Jason. The message preview was innocuous. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. But my heart sank. I didn't touch the phone. I couldn't bring myself to cross that line. Not yet. But the message confirmed what I'd been trying to deny. This wasn't just in my head. Something was happening, and I needed to know the truth. That night, I made a decision I never thought I'd have to make. I was going to investigate my wife. Once I decided to investigate, I felt a strange mix of guilt and resolve. Part of me still clung to the hope that I was wrong, that this was all a misunderstanding and Caroline would forgive me for my distrust. But the other part, the part fueled by doubt and unease, knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I had to know. The first step was subtle. I started paying closer attention to her routines. Caroline had always been a creature of habit, but lately, her patterns had shifted. She was spending more time at work, leaving earlier in the morning, and coming home later in the evening. When she was home, she was often glued to her phone, texting with a faint, almost secretive smile on her face. It wasn't enough. I needed more concrete answers. That's when I decided to take the plunge. One evening, while Caroline was out with friends, or so she said, I installed a small camera in our living room and another in the kitchen. I told myself it was only temporary, just until I had clarity. The next day, I took it a step further. I purchased a voice recorder and discreetly hid it in her car. It felt wrong, violating her privacy like this, but I couldn't stop myself. The doubts had taken over, and I was willing to do whatever it took to uncover the truth. My most daring move, however, was cloning her phone. It wasn't easy. I had to wait for a moment when she left it unattended, which was rare. One Saturday morning, while she was taking a long shower, I seized the opportunity. With my hands trembling, I connected her phone to a cloning app I downloaded. The process took only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. That evening, as I sifted through the messages and notifications now synced to my device, I felt like I was crossing a line I could never uncross. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for, or what I had feared. There were texts from a number labeled simply as work. At first glance, they seemed innocent enough, but as I read further, the context shifted. Phrases like "last night was amazing" and "I can't stop thinking about you" made it clear these weren't professional exchanges. The messages painted a picture I didn't want to see. Caroline had been meeting someone she was deeply involved with. And the worst part? There was a second phone, a hidden device she used exclusively for these conversations. By the time I finished reading, I felt physically ill. My chest was tight, my stomach churned, and my mind raced with 1,000 questions. How long had this been going on? Who was this person? And most painfully, had our entire marriage been a lie? That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying everything I'd uncovered, trying to piece together the fragments of a story I didn't want to believe. The Caroline I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, felt like a stranger. The following morning, I felt like I was walking through a fog. The weight of what I had discovered clung to me, but I couldn't let it show. Caroline was cheerful, humming a tune while making breakfast, as if nothing was wrong. I couldn't decide if her demeanor was genuine or a mask, but either way, it felt like a cruel mockery of what I now knew. As the days passed, the evidence continued to pile up. With every message synced to my phone and every snippet of conversation captured by the recorder in her car, the truth became clearer. The name Jason appeared again and again, always in context that made my stomach churn. They'd met multiple times in places I recognized. The restaurant where we'd celebrated anniversaries, the park where we used to take the kids. But the biggest blow came when I found the second phone. I knew it existed from the text I'd read, but seeing it with my own eyes was another matter entirely. Caroline had hidden it well, tucked away in the bottom of a box in our closet, beneath old sweaters she rarely wore. When I turned it on, the lock screen lit up with a photo of her and Jason, smiling, carefree, arms around each other. My hands shook as I unlocked the phone. The messages on this device were far more explicit, far more intimate. "I can't wait to see you again. Last night was perfect. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. He suspects something. I love you." Those 3 words hit me like a freight train. I sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the phone in my hands, my mind spinning. Caroline had fallen in love with this man. This wasn't just a fling. It was something deeper, something that had been growing right under my nose. I thought of our children, my children. For years, I had poured my heart into being the best father I could be. I had coached soccer games, stayed up late helping with homework, and bandaged scraped knees. Now, with every revelation, a sickening doubt began to creep in. Were they even mine? I didn't want to know the answer, but I couldn't ignore the question either. That night, I ordered DNA testing kits online. It felt like another betrayal to even consider the possibility, but I needed to know the full extent of the lies I had been living. Caroline, oblivious to my growing knowledge, carried on as if everything was normal. She kissed me goodnight, asked about my day, and laughed at jokes I could barely muster the energy to tell. It was surreal, like living in two different realities. In one reality, I was her husband, the man she had promised to love and honor. In the other, I was the outsider, the fool she had deceived for years. The DNA testing kits arrived sooner than I expected, their plain, unassuming packaging a stark contrast to the emotional storm they represented. I had debated for days whether to go through with it, but in the end, my need for answers outweighed the fear of what I might uncover. I collected the samples one quiet evening while Caroline was out working late. A few strands of hair from her brush, cheek swabs from the children under the guise of a silly game, and finally my own. The process was simple, almost clinical, but my hands trembled the entire time. Sending off the samples felt like sealing a fate I wasn't ready to face. For days, I lived in limbo, oscillating between hope and dread. I prayed, something I hadn't done in years, that I was wrong, that the children were mine, that this nightmare would have some semblance of mercy. The results arrived in my inbox one evening while Caroline was in the shower. My heart pounded as I opened the email, my hands clammy as I scrolled to the section that mattered most. Probability of paternity, 0%. Twice. For both children. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Not only had Caroline betrayed me, but the two children I had loved, raised, and sacrificed for weren't mine. They were his Jason's. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my head spun, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled to the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before I vomited. The shock, the heartbreak, the sheer weight of it all. It was too much to process. Caroline emerged from the shower, wrapped in a towel, her hair damp and clinging to her shoulders. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. I wanted to scream, to throw the evidence in her face, to demand answers. But instead, I shook my head, muttering something about feeling unwell. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more time to think, to plan, to decide what my next move would be. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling while she drifted off to sleep. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on me, suffocating and inescapable. The woman I had loved, the family I had cherished, it was all a lie. But beneath the pain, a new resolve began to take shape. I couldn't let her win. I wouldn't let her destroy me completely. If Caroline had spent years weaving this web of deception, I would spend however long it took unraveling it. The morning after receiving the DNA results, I felt like a man hollowed out, operating on autopilot. Caroline moved around the house as if nothing had changed, oblivious to the fact that her lies were unraveling around her. She smiled at me over coffee, asked about my plans for the day, and kissed me lightly before heading to work. I nodded and played along, though my mind was already miles ahead, plotting my next moves. The first step was to consult a lawyer. I didn't tell anyone, especially Caroline, where I was going or why. I picked a firm recommended by a trusted colleague and met with an attorney named Sarah, a sharp, no-nonsense professional who immediately understood the gravity of my situation. As I recounted everything, the affair, the hidden phone, the DNA results, I saw her expression shift from neutral professionalism to something resembling disbelief. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and folded her hands on the desk. "This is one of the most egregious cases of betrayal I've heard," she said. "But it's also one of the most complex. We need to approach this carefully." Sarah explained my options. Divorce was the obvious route, but there were financial and legal nuances to consider, especially with the children involved. While I wasn't their biological father, I had been listed as such on their birth certificates, which could complicate matters. "We'll need to prove paternity, or lack thereof, in court," she said. "You also need to think about your assets. If your wife has been dishonest about her personal life, there's a chance she hasn't been forthright about finances either." The mention of finances hit me like a slap. Caroline and I had shared bank accounts, investments, and even a mortgage on our home. If she had been funneling money into another life with Jason, I needed to know. Sarah gave me a checklist. Gather financial records, document evidence of the affair, and avoid any direct confrontation until we had a solid case. "You need to protect yourself first," she warned. Once she knows you're onto her, things could escalate. I left the office feeling both overwhelmed and determined. This was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It was about reclaiming control over my life. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. I dug into our finances, combing through bank statements and credit card bills. There were subtle red flags I'd never noticed before. Unexplained cash withdrawals, hotel charges, and purchases that didn't match our usual spending habits. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, the cameras and voice recorders continued to provide damning evidence. Caroline and Jason were still in constant contact, planning their next rendezvous and discussing their future. Hearing her talk about when we're finally free made my blood boil, but it also steeled my resolve. Through it all, I found an unexpected ally in Michelle, my professional assistant. She'd noticed I wasn't myself and asked if everything was okay. At first, I brushed her off, but eventually I confided in her. Michelle was a rock, calm, practical, and fiercely loyal. She helped me organize documents, sift through financial records, and even recommended a forensic accountant to dig deeper. Her support was a lifeline in the chaos, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't completely alone. The days leading up to the confrontation were some of the most surreal of my life. Caroline and I continued to live under the same roof, but the cracks in our relationship grew wider with every passing moment. I could feel her watching me, sensing the shift in my demeanor, though she couldn't yet pinpoint why. I began pulling away in subtle ways, avoiding unnecessary conversations, skipping our usual evening routines, and spending more time at the office. Caroline noticed. "You've been distant lately," she said one evening, her tone half concerned, half accusatory. "Is everything okay?" I looked at her, the woman I had loved for years, and felt a pang of sadness that nearly buckled me. But I couldn't let her see that. "Just work stress," I replied, forcing a tired smile. "Nothing to worry about." She seemed to accept the answer, but the unease lingered between us. Behind the scenes, I was preparing for the inevitable fallout. Sarah, my lawyer, had everything lined up: the evidence of the affair, the financial discrepancies, and the DNA results. We had even drafted the divorce papers, ready to serve Caroline the moment I decided to move forward. But I wasn't ready to confront her yet, not until I was sure I could handle the emotional aftermath. Meanwhile, the recordings from her car and the messages from her hidden phone revealed that she and Jason were growing impatient. They wanted to move on, to start their lives together openly. The audacity of it was staggering. One afternoon, while Caroline was out, I sat down in my home office and played back a recent recording from her car. Jason's voice was unmistakable, deep and self-assured, as he spoke about their plans. "When are you going to tell him?" he asked. "Soon," Caroline replied, her voice hesitant. I need to find the right time. He's been so distant lately. I think he suspects something." Hearing her admit, it was like a dagger to the heart. The woman I had trusted with everything, my love, my life, my children, was strategizing how to leave me while continuing to lie to my face. That night, I stared at her across the dinner table, my appetite gone. She was scrolling through her phone, laughing softly at something on the screen. I wondered if it was Jason. The thought made me grip my fork, so tightly my knuckles turned white. I excused myself early and went to bed, lying awake as Caroline eventually climbed in beside me. The silence between us was deafening, a void filled with all the things left unsaid. It was a Saturday evening when everything came to a head. I hadn't planned for it to happen that night, but the weight of the lies, the betrayal, and the charade we were living finally became too much to bear. Caroline had just come back from running errands, though I knew she had spent the afternoon with Jason. I'd seen the footage from the hidden cameras, watch her leave the house dressed casually, but return hours later with her hair and makeup slightly disheveled, her expression lighter, almost glowing. As she walked through the door, she smiled at me, a practiced, effortless grin that felt like an insult. "Hey," she said casually. "How was your day?" "I couldn't do it anymore." "Caroline," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We need to talk." She froze, her hand still on the door handle. The smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of unease. "Okay," she said slowly, closing the door behind her. What's going on? I gestured toward the living room. See? She hesitated but complied, perching on the edge of the couch. I remained standing, arms crossed, staring down at her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension was suffocating. I know about Jason, I said finally, the words slicing through the silence like a knife. Caroline's eyes widened, her face draining of color. What are you talking about? She stammered. Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. I snapped. I know about the affair. I've seen the messages, the calls, the meetings. I've seen the photos. I know everything, Caroline. She sat there, stunned into silence, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. Finally, she said, You went through my things? Are you serious right now? I said, my voice rising. That's what you're upset about? Not the fact that you've been lying to me for God knows how long? Not the fact that you've been seeing someone else while pretending to be my wife. Tears welled up in her eyes. It's not what you think. Don't. I interrupted, my voice cold. Don't you dare try to spin this. I've heard the recordings, Caroline. I've seen the messages. I even found your second phone. You've been lying to me for years, haven't you? She broke down then, covering her face with her hands. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I didn't mean for it to happen. Stop, I said sharply, cutting her off. You don't get to play the victim here. You didn't mean for it to happen? You've been carrying on with him for years. You lied to me, you lied to the kids. My voice caught on the word, and I felt my anger flare again. Or should I say your kids? Her head shot up, her tear-streaked face pale. What do you mean? I mean I did a DNA test, I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. Neither of them are mine, Caroline. You've been lying to me about that, too. The silence that followed was deafening. Caroline's face crumpled, and she let out a broken sob. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear I didn't know for sure. That's a lie, I said, my voice ice cold. You knew. Maybe not at first, but you knew. And you let me raise them, love them, believe they were mine. You let me build my entire life on a lie. She reached out as if to touch me, but I stepped back. Don't, I said firmly. Don't touch me. You've done enough. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice trembling. I looked at her, the woman I had once loved, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said. You'll be hearing from her soon. I want you out of this house, Caroline. And don't even think about trying to fight me on this. I have all the evidence I need. Her sobs grew louder, but I turned and walked away, leaving her on the couch, crumbling under the weight of her choices. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of relief. The confrontation was over, and I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. Caroline was served with divorce papers 3 days later. I wasn't there to see her reaction. I made sure I was at work when the process server arrived at the house. But the aftermath was clear when I returned home that evening. She was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and tear-streaked. The divorce papers sat on the coffee table between us like a silent judge. You really went through with it, she said, her voice hollow. I didn't sit down. I couldn't bring myself to share even that small sense of intimacy with her. What did you expect? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. After everything you've done, did you really think I'd just let it go? She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Once I might have felt the urge to comfort her. Now, I stood there, unmoved, watching the woman I had loved crumble under the weight of her own lies. The legal process moved quickly. My lawyer, Sarah, had prepared for this, ensuring that I was protected every step of the way. The evidence of Caroline's affair and the paternity results gave us leverage in negotiations. I filed for sole ownership of our house and a majority of our shared assets, arguing that she had already been siphoning resources into her secret life with Jason. Caroline fought at first, claiming she had contributed just as much to our life together. But when Sarah laid out the evidence, bank statements, hotel receipts, and a breakdown of her financial indiscretions, her resistance crumbled. The hardest part, though, was the decision about the children. Legally, I had no obligation to continue supporting them. They weren't biologically mine, and my lawyer assured me that the courts would recognize that fact. But walking away from them wasn't as simple as signing a paper. I had raised them, loved them, and been their father in every way that mattered, except one. Caroline begged me not to abandon them. "They don't know," she said, tears streaming down her face. "They think you're their dad. Please don't punish them for my mistakes." Her words stung, but they didn't sway me. "You should have thought about that before you lied to me," I said coldly. "You put us all in this position, Caroline, not me." That night, I wrote each of them a letter. I couldn't bring myself to face them in person. Not yet, but I needed them to know the truth. I kept the letters simple, explaining that I loved them, but that there were things beyond my control that were forcing me to step away. It was the most painful decision I've ever made, but I knew it was the right one for me. Staying in their lives would have been a constant reminder of Caroline's betrayal, a wound that would never heal. As the days turned into weeks, Caroline moved out of the house. She didn't go to Jason. Not yet, at least. I think part of her hoped I would change my mind, that I would forgive her and let her back into my life. But that was never going to happen. I was done being a pawn in her game. With Caroline gone, the house felt both emptier and lighter. The weight of her betrayal still lingered, but the space was now mine. No more lies hiding in its corners. I threw myself into my work, taking on new projects at the firm and focusing on rebuilding my life. Michelle was a constant source of support. She seemed to know when to offer a kind word and when to give me space. Her presence became a steadying force as I navigated the aftermath of the divorce and the emotional fallout of cutting ties with the children. But the decision to leave them wasn't something I could easily put behind me. I avoided their photos, boxed up their belongings, and tried to convince myself I'd done what was necessary. Yet, memories crept in, soccer games, bedtime stories, their laughter echoing through the house. Michelle noticed the strain. "You're allowed to feel torn," she said one evening after I confided in her. "What Caroline did doesn't erase the love you gave those kids." That was real. Her words were comforting but bittersweet. I couldn't undo the damage, nor could I rewrite the past. All I could do was move forward one step at a time. As the weeks turned into months, the wounds left by Caroline's betrayal began to scab over. The emptiness in the house felt less oppressive, and I started to find solace in the quiet. It was in this calm that I began noticing something I hadn't before, a growing connection with Michelle. She had been my rock through the chaos, always there with a steady hand and an open ear. At first, I dismissed the feelings as misplaced gratitude or a byproduct of my emotional vulnerability. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized it was something deeper. One evening, as we wrapped up a long workday, Michelle hesitated before leaving. "Do you want to grab dinner?" she asked, her voice tentative. The question caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered saying no, worried about complicating things. But then I thought about how much I had relied on her, how her presence had brought a sense of stability to my life. "I'd like that," I said, surprising even myself. Over dinner, we talked about everything, our lives, our dreams, and the chaos of the past few months. It felt easy, natural, and unforced. For the first time in a long while, I caught myself smiling, not out of politeness but from genuine warmth. As we walked back to our cars, Michelle turned to me. "You've been through so much," she said softly, "but you're stronger than you think. You deserve to find happiness again." Her words stayed with me long after we said goodnight. For the first time since my life had been turned upside down, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by betrayal or loss. The weeks after that dinner with Michelle were different. I found myself looking forward to our conversations, the little moments we shared at work, and the quiet understanding she always seemed to offer. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't just surviving. I was beginning to feel alive again. Still, the thought of opening up to someone terrified me. Caroline's betrayal had left scars, and the idea of letting someone close felt like stepping into uncharted territory. Michelle, perceptive as ever, seemed to sense my hesitation. "You're overthinking again," she said one evening as we worked late on a project. I smiled faintly, shrugging. Can you blame me? Trust doesn't come easy these days. No, I can't, she said, her tone gentle. But not everyone's like her. Some people actually mean what they say. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I let myself consider the possibility. What if she was right? What if not everyone was like Caroline? One Friday evening, I decided to take a leap. After another late night at the office, I asked Michelle if she wanted to join me for dinner again. Her smile was all the answer I needed. Over the meal, our conversations grew deeper. She shared stories about her own life, her struggles, and her dreams. It felt easy, natural. Nothing like the guarded interactions I'd had with Caroline in the final years of our marriage. As the night went on, I realized something. I trusted her. It wasn't just about her actions or her words. It was the way she made me feel seen, heard, and valued. Walking her to her car that night, I found myself saying the words I hadn't planned but couldn't hold back. Thank you for being there for me. I don't know where I'd be without you. Michelle smiled, her eyes soft. You'd be fine, stronger than you think. But I'm glad I could help. She leaned in, brushing a light kiss on my cheek before stepping back. Good night, she said, her voice warm. As I watched her drive away, I felt something stir in me, a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, I could let someone in again. After that dinner with Michelle, something shifted within me. Her support, which had been a lifeline during my darkest days, started to feel like something more. Her understanding, patience, and kindness helped me see a glimmer of hope where I once saw only darkness. Michelle never pushed me. She didn't demand explanations or expect quick decisions. She simply stood by me, steady and unwavering. One evening, as we worked late at the office, I decided to open up to her. I began, my voice hesitant. After everything with Caroline, I didn't think I'd ever be able to trust someone again. Michelle looked at me with those warm, steady eyes of hers. She didn't interrupt, just let me speak. But with you, I continued, it feels different. You make it feel possible, like trusting someone isn't as terrifying as I thought it would be. She smiled softly, setting down the papers in her hands. It's okay to feel scared, she said gently. After what you've been through, anyone would. But trust isn't something you have to force. It's something you build. And I'm here, no matter how long it takes. Her words felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I didn't feel rushed or judged. She gave me the space I needed, but also a foundation to rebuild on. As the weeks went by, our bond grew stronger. We spent more time together, not just at work, but in quiet, meaningful moments outside of it. Shared dinners, conversations that stretched late into the night, and her calm presence started to feel like the parts of a life I had once lost but could have again. One evening, as we sat on the couch with empty plates and a quiet house around us, I found myself smiling, genuinely smiling, for the first time in what felt like years. Michelle looked at me, her expression a mix of curiosity and warmth. What are you thinking about? That maybe I can actually start over, I said, my voice steady but quiet. That maybe I don't have to be stuck in the past anymore. She reached over, her hand brushing mine. You can, and you deserve to. Moving forward wasn't easy, but for the first time, it felt possible. With Michelle by my side, the overwhelming weight of betrayal and loss began to lighten. She didn't try to fix me or rush my healing. Instead, she simply showed up, patient, steady, and kind. We started spending more time together outside of work. What began as casual dinners turned into hikes on weekends, quiet evenings on the couch, and even moments of laughter I hadn't thought I'd feel again. Michelle's presence wasn't just comforting, it was grounding. One evening, as we sat in my backyard under a sky full of stars, I told her something I hadn't shared with anyone. There was a time when I thought my life was over. I admitted, my voice low, that everything I'd worked for, believed in, was gone. Michelle looked at me, her expression soft but serious. It wasn't over, she said. It just had to change, and sometimes change is brutal, but it doesn't mean you can't rebuild. Her words stayed with me. She was right. I couldn't erase the pain or undo the damage Caroline had caused, but I could choose how to move forward. And for the first time, I truly wanted to. Taking a deep breath, I decided to take a step I'd been avoiding. I reached out to the children. not to rekindle a relationship, but to explain. I wrote each of them a heartfelt letter, apologizing for my absence, but also gently sharing the truth about what had happened. It was painful but necessary, a small step toward closure. With Michelle, I started to trust again. It wasn't always easy. Old fears and doubts lingered, but she never wavered. One evening, as we walked through the park, I turned to her and said, "I think I'm ready to see where this goes. With us." Michelle smiled, her eyes warm. "I've been ready," she said simply. Life with Michelle felt like a second chance, a life I never thought I'd have again. She brought a sense of calm and warmth to my days, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living. The scars from my past didn't disappear, but they no longer consumed me. Instead, they became a part of my story, reminders of what I'd endured and how far I'd come. Michelle understood that. She didn't try to erase the pain, but helped me find meaning in it. We started building a life together, slowly and deliberately. Our days were filled with small, meaningful moments. Coffee on the porch in the mornings, shared laughter over dinner, quiet evenings with books or movies. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, but it was real, and it was ours. One day, as we walked along the trail at a nearby park, Michelle asked me a question that stayed with me. "What's the biggest lesson you've learned from all of this?" I thought about it for a moment, the weight of everything I'd been through pressing gently against my chest. "That strength doesn't come from avoiding pain," I said finally. "It comes from facing it, even when it feels impossible. And that sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is letting go of what you thought your life was supposed to be." Michelle smiled and took my hand. "Well, I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." As I looked at her, I realized how much I'd gained despite everything I'd lost. My life wasn't what I'd planned, but maybe that was okay. I had found love again, not just with Michelle, but with myself, with the person I'd become through all the hardship. Standing there, with her hand in mine and the future stretching out before us, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And this time, I knew it was real.